What's up, everyone? Rod Rodriguez here, and we are just about ready to kick off the next season of Military Matters. We have some great topics and stories we're tackling, but before we do, we wanted to share one more episode with you from our catalog. The episode we're re-releasing caught a lot of attention from you, our listeners, and by attention, we got some supportive emails and some pretty angry ones as well. The funny thing, though, about those angry emails was it seems to me that those people hadn't actually listened to the episode. They just got all angry about the title. The points they were making made absolutely zero sense if you listen to the content of the episode and the guests we have on. So, I implore you, before you fire off an email to us at militarymatters@stripes.com, please ensure you didn't just read the title of the episode and get mad. Take the time to actually listen to the episode, and if you're still mad, shoot us an email about why. We might even do a follow-up with you because maybe we missed something and you caught it. Also, feel free to share show ideas, or if you have a tip, you can share it with us at militarymatters@stripes.com. Don't forget, next week, we will be back with a brand new episode as we kick off the next season of Military Matters. Before then, let's get this show on the road. This episode was originally published July 13th of last year. We hope you enjoy What is Woke and Critical Race Theory. I'll see you next week. Anyone who served a single day of their life in uniform can tell you that the military working environment has always been somewhat politically incorrect. Much to the chagrin of EO reps everywhere, the working environment within the DoD as a whole is more often than not rife with jokes and conversations that would be considered NSFW or not safe for work in the civilian sector. For some, this is a way of life that distinguishes the military from other occupations, a place for the rough and tumble, a work environment not for the thin-skinned, and where the color of said skin doesn't matter, because at some point you will be at the pointy end of a joke. But at the end of the day, we all wear green or blue or whatever color your branch holds dear. Simply, we're all brothers and sisters at the end. Some of you are nodding your head right now in agreement. That is how it is, it should be, and that this woke stuff is trying to rob us all of military culture. Others might be shaking their head that the culture described as a smokescreen for racist, sexist, and toxic leaders to mask despicable behavior behind the notion that it was a, quote, just a joke, and that those offended should lighten up. That's just the workplace culture argument, which could probably eat up an entire episode on its own. There's also diversity and inclusion that's been wrapped up into this woke discussion. Only a very confident racist would go out on a limb and publicly out themselves by disagreeing with racial inclusion or equality. The issue of diversity, though, is far from black and white. Seriously, no pun intended. It's shades of gray where some argue there's no racial, gender, or external factors of disparity anymore, that we should judge service members strictly by performance, and that any effort to populate schools, positions, or awards with respect to race, gender, or sexual preference is in itself unethical. Let's start at the beginning, or at least the earliest uses of woke in social context that I could find. There are several periods of history that have used variations of awake, awoke, awakening, and so on, such as the Great Awakening and its subsequent awakenings in early Christian history that took their namesake from the idea that civilization and/or its communities were waking up from the slumber of ignorance to the Word of God. We can also find a more political use in the 1850s with the Wide Awakes, a Republican political group that evolved into a paramilitary organization that took to the streets to protest against slavery and to support the presidential nominee, Abraham Lincoln. There were even opposition groups that named themselves as a play off the name the Wide Awakes, calling themselves the Chloroformers, as they would put the Wide Awakes to sleep. The first social reference to the word woke, as we might use it today, is seen in 1962 in a New York Times article by African-American novelist William Melvin Kelly titled, "If You're Woke, You Dig It." In this article, he used the word woke to describe the appropriation of African-American slang by white beatniks. Then in 1971, in the play Garvey Lives, Garvey being Marcus Garvey, a controversial African-American activist of the early 1900s, we get the line, quote, "I've been sleeping all my life, and now that Mr. Garvey done woke me up, I'm going to stay woke, and I'm going to help him wake up other black folks," end quote. All right, so let's stop right here in 1971. We're only 6 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So before we go any further down the woke rabbit hole, let's look at exactly what woke means right now in 1971. It means being aware. It's a term alluding to having been asleep, unaware, maybe even ignorant of something bigger. For early Christians, it was an awakening to God, and later it would be just about being asleep or unaware of the dangers of travesty that was slavery, racism, and discrimination. But woke became synonymous with being aware of social injustice. So that's basically woke in 1971. And we would see the term pop up again in rap, poetry, literature, usually in reference to the ongoing post-civil rights racial issues that this country would face well into the 2000s and as recently as the riots and protests over the death of George Floyd. But the word woke has picked up other uses along the way. Folks from groups that feel discriminated against, that feel they too have issues of inequality that society has been ignoring and want others to wake up to. Members of the LGBTQ plus community, feminists, races other than white and black, subgroups of folks who feel they have a voice that isn't being heard. That's all good. But that's also added a lot of baggage to the term. Organizations like the military are trying to educate its forces about all of those different voices, some of whom live lifestyles that run directly contradictory with the values of some of its own service members, or whose inclusion some feel puts the military's readiness at risk. A few weeks ago, I put out the question of what woke means to you and what you think it means to the military. I put that question out over social media and in quite a few military and veteran Facebook groups. The written responses were overall pretty negative. The general consensus I got was woke meant you were a complainer, a racist, weak-minded, a communist, or that you simply hated America. Dan Crenshaw, a representative from Texas, tweeted in May that, quote, "Enough is enough. We won't let our military fall to woke ideology," end quote. He mentions woke again during an appearance on Fox and Friends when he was asked what would have happened to him had he turned his back on the American flag while standing in formation or during the national anthem, as Olympian Gwen Berry did on the awards podium after finishing third in the U.S. Olympics. This is Dan Crenshaw on Fox and Friends.
But the problem going on in the military now is that there's more of an incentive to turn away from the flag, to say something woke, than there is to fight against it. That's the truth. I'll never forget when this...
You mean like the rest of the country?
Right.
In the same way I put out my question of what woke meant to you, I put out a phone number that had a voicemail with the message to leave your thoughts on what woke meant to you and the military, but this time, the response was zero. I had one call and one message, and that was from a gentleman named David who wanted to know if I had served with him in 4th ID. And unfortunately, David, I never served with 4th ID. I legitimately wanted to have this conversation, or to at least hear from someone who would talk about the term woke and what it meant to them. Luckily, Jack Murphy knew someone who was willing to have this conversation with me.
My name is Brian Kimber. I'm commonly known as BK. I host a weekly news podcast that's fairly popular at this point, called World News with BK. It's once a week, concentrates on international news, conflict, military, and of course, politics. And my background was United States Air Force Pararescueman.
BK has been a pretty staunch critic of woke ideology, so I asked him what was woke to him.
It's a very, very tough question. It's one of those questions. It's such a broad concept. I suppose woke means to me an overemphasis on differentiating characteristics such as race, gender, class, and this focus on it comes at the detriment to other more relevant differences and other more relevant tasks which we could be accomplishing. That's what woke means to me, especially when it comes to our schools and our education systems. Last I checked, we haven't quite mastered reading, writing, and arithmetic, and yet we have time for all this nonsense about race and gender starting at a very, very young age. And it is divisive. And a lot of this, just because it's not called critical race theory, is being taught. And it's being taught in kind of a manner that's almost meant to divide. And yes, a lot of this stuff does have roots in Marxist teachings going back to the 70s. And it seems like all of this stuff is meant to divide us as a people rather than bringing us together. And I'm not one of these people who's like, oh, I don't see color. Of course I see color. Everybody sees color. I say on the podcast all the time, I'm like, oh, you're a black guy. Cool. What's that like? Oh, you're a Mexican chick. Cool. What's that like? I'm a white guy. This is what it's like. You know, I see color. And in the military, as you probably know, the color and differences in color have traditionally been a way to break down these barriers in gender, because there's not too many places in the United States where you could take some poor hillbilly from Mississippi and have him be best friends with some city black guy from the Bronx, you know, and they turn out to be best friends because they all come together in the military. And that's something that's always been unique in the military. And to me, this new focus on these racial differences is really putting tension where there wasn't any before. And that's why I do not care for it myself.
BK mentions critical race theory, and we'll get into that in a second, but let's get back to woke. BK talked about woke being an, quote, overemphasis on differentiating characteristics such as race, gender, class, and this focus on it comes at the detriment to other more relevant differences and other more relevant tasks which we could be accomplishing, end quote. This is a pretty common concern that I've heard expressed in private conversations about this topic, that woke is really an agenda meant to divide folks through overemphasizing the things that differentiate us, such as race, gender, and class, as opposed to talking about the things that unify us. The focus on racial differences
is really putting tension where there wasn't any before, and that's why I do not care for it myself.
But as a Latino service member myself, I can tell you that I've seen racial tension in the military, and I have been at the pointy end of racism. I asked BK if he really felt that there had never been racial tensions in the military.
I absolutely think there's been racial tension in the military, but there's going to be racial tension in America, period, because America is a unique nation, right? We're a melting pot. Other nations don't have these huge populations of different ethnic minorities, different religions. They just don't have it. You know, America has always been unique in that way. When you have different cultures mixing like that, you have different ethnicities mixing, you always have tension. And for all the problems we have in America, and I say this all the time, what we have in America isn't anything compared to some of these countries overseas. I mean, look at countries like Myanmar. You have thousands of people being butchered over religion. Look at Iraq. You couldn't tell the difference between a Sunni and a Shia. They can tell the difference, and that difference alone was enough for them to have this civil war for the last 10 years where they're murdering each other by the thousands. So we have to put in context our racial problems in America. To me, and this is an indication of we don't know world events very well in America, the racial differences in America, in my opinion, pale in comparison to ethnic conflict overseas, where literally they're having genocide and civil war over these perceived ethnic differences. We don't have that in America. We have some fighting. We have some viral videos, that go on. We have some racial slurs thrown around. We do not have what's going on in these other countries.
In comparison with the racial genocide in less developed countries, sure, our racial issues seem pretty petty. Lawmakers aren't proposing rounding up folks by race and systematically killing them. Our country is a melting pot, as BK stated, and if you've ever seen a real pot with something melting in it, you'll know that it isn't a hospitable place. So yeah, tensions here are real. People get hurt, people get killed. And if there's anything we can learn from those countries engaged in ethnic cleansing is how not to go down the roads that have led to that. But there's a difference between learning about ugly parts of your history, and learning victimization. We talked about what woke meant, being aware of social injustice. I wanted to know what BK thought of that definition as opposed to the woke ideology he and folks like Representative Crenshaw were referring to.
Well, I know that's what the meaning is, but because I heard it used so often by people that I disliked, I most often use it as a pejorative now. I'm not going to lie. So I'll take the hit on that one. But I feel like wokeness has become like a shield as well. And it's blocking real criticism. And I think a perfect example is the transgender movement throughout the last few years in the military. And it's funny because I have several transgender listeners I know who I correspond with, and I've had discussions with them. But the fact is the media grossly distorted what Trump's transgender policy was. Contrary to what they kept putting out, transgenders were not banned from the military under Trump. You could be transgender. You just could not have any medical treatment. Like if you were like, hey, I've decided I'm a woman, then you're like, all right, well, you're a woman. You're not going to change your name tag or anything, right? All right, get back to work. And so you could be transgender. What you couldn't do was get put on disability and go off for extensive hormonal therapy or gender reassignment surgery. And that seemed, and so now people are like, well, what you hate transgenders? No, I don't hate transgenders. As a matter of fact, I have a lot of compassion for them because I feel like they're dealing with a lot of inner demons. But the fact is, like, look, I was retired from the military for a rare disease that didn't even affect me. I mean, I was like looking to go to the JSOC teams at the time. I'm at the top of my game. I was fast, strong, about 6 years in, learning the job. I was good. And I was out. The military does not exist. They're not usually in the business of keeping people around who need extensive medical treatment. But now all of a sudden, we're being led to believe that it's no big deal for a service member to decide that they're transgender. And now they'd like extensive hormone therapy and or gender reassignment surgery. That is a legitimate criticism because now you're leaving work. You're going off of work to deal with this. And the media has no interest in finding out how non-deployable these people are. So I think the wokeness is almost like a shield because there are real criticisms here to be made about this policy, especially with the transgender policy. We still keep people out who have asthma. We still keep people out who have credit problems. But you mean to tell me that this person who's going to need extensive ongoing medical treatment, I'm just supposed to be like, well, that's cool though, because it's transgender. If you were a cancer patient, they wouldn't take you. If you had all kinds of other problems, they wouldn't take you. They kicked me out for this. So I think it disguises what's legitimate criticism. And the VA now is doing these procedures they announced last week. I mean, I have combat veteran friends who've been waiting for years for treatment. And now the VA is going to be in the business, and whether you like it or not, this is still an elective surgery. And by that, I'm saying doctors have said, okay, no, it's medically necessary. That's debatable. Are you going to die if you do not get your gender reassignment surgery? No, you will not. So to me, that's an elective surgery. So I don't like the shield of the wokeness because, again, I think it really hides, and it's a way to stifle and shout down people who have legitimate, salient criticism.
I really do understand BK's position here because often in social issues, I find myself engaged in all or nothing arguments. For example, BK clearly states,
no, I don't hate transgenders. As a matter of fact, I have a lot of compassion for them because I feel like they're dealing with a lot of inner demons.
But because he disagrees with some transgender advocates who feel that the government should pay for gender reassignment surgery, he has been criticized for that position, alluding to him being a homophobe or not supporting transgendered people. The all or nothing argument has really been the hallmark of our nation's political atmosphere as of late. A Republican who doesn't agree with all the tenets of the party's president or presidential nominee is suddenly a bad Republican, and replace the word Republican for Democrat, and the same applies. Social issues have gone the same route in some ways for certain people and certain groups that will label you an enemy of a cause if you don't wholly accept their definition of an ally. BK is echoing the sentiment of many veterans and service members that I've spoken to over the last several weeks who feel like they can't express criticism over aspects of hot-button social issues. Not complete disagreement, but criticism of aspects of issues without fear of being labeled a racist, a homophobe, chauvinist, or whatever negative label there is to brand someone. This is why I understand the reluctance to leave a voicemail about one's thoughts or feelings on what woke meant to you. Cancel culture is a real thing, and so is punitive action through UCMJ. But perhaps just as damaging is the accusation that you're a racist or a homophobe or whatever. The argument that the DoD shouldn't be taking time to train its service members about a particular topic isn't necessarily the same as disagreeing with the topic at hand.
And that's what drives me crazy in today's discourse. You say one thing and everybody's like, oh, you're one of those people. No, I'm not, because I also think this. But we don't have in this crazy social media driven world, it's not possible to hold like many different beliefs anymore, apparently, which is why I like the podcast format, because I have 2.5 hours to kind of explain things and have long drawn out ideas. This Twitter world we live in is not conducive to these ideas or holding multiple beliefs at once. And it drives me nuts.
We've navigated through the woke rabbit hole. Now it's time to walk through the critical race theory minefield. What is critical race theory? Do we have time to teach it? Should we be teaching it in the military? When we return.
Would you agree that critical race theory should or should not be taught in our military academies?
As I said earlier, thanks, Congressman, for the question, and thanks for your continued support. Thanks for your service.
Thank you.
This is not something that the United States military is embracing and pushing and causing people to subscribe to. Whether or not this was some sort of critical examination of different theories, I don't know. But
we need to understand our past. I want to be very clear. But can you agree at least that understanding whiteness and white rage presented in Ike Hall over 100 cadets probably is something that we shouldn't be teaching our future leaders of the United States Army?
As you have described it, it certainly sounds like that's something that should not occur. Again, I would like to know the specifics of the...
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
That was an exchange between Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida. Critical race theory, or CRT, as it is called, like woke, has become a popular term as of late because of exchanges like these between lawmakers and the Department of Defense. Finding a real definition for CRT that didn't feel politically slanted was pretty difficult, and perhaps it's impossible. But I did my best and found an expert who helped shed some light on this topic that somewhat goes hand in hand with woke.
My name is John Witte. I'm a professor emeritus from the University of Wisconsin Madison in the departments of political science and the Robert Lafollette School of Public Affairs, which is a public policy school. And I'm because of my work in education, which is all inner city education, I become involved in a lot of racial issues.
So what is critical race theory?
Well, it does not have a specific meaning, a singular meaning. It's used very differently by different people. The commonality is two things. One is that current racial issues are inherent in society, and they trace back to slavery. So we're talking, really, when you talk critical race theory, we're talking about African American race theory, not because it does, that's the common thing. It's the thread is it goes back to slavery, and there's a lot of differences after that point, because some of the proponents will think that that is a current issue and the current responsibility of people today because of that fact. And there are some, I think, a lot of white proponents who say, wait a minute, I agree with you that the problems are there. We agree that the origins may be slavery, but it's pretty hard for me to understand why I should be held responsible for something that happened 10 generations ago. So that's the difference that you hear right now in the big controversy over critical race theory. at least among the white population and the non-African American population.
There are lots of criticisms about CRT, one of which Dr. Witte touched on is that for some, it's about blaming white people of today as a whole for historical events, policies, and governance. I wanted to know if this type of blame was academically supported as part of critical race theory.
There's no more consistency in the academic world on this subject than in the media world or in the everyday world. It's really something it's a phrase that has taken the life in the last few weeks. It's been there for many years, but taken new life after January 6th, I think is when it really started back in. I think that was very important because of what happened on that day. But I think there's the academic community is just as split over the use of it as not. And they're also split very much. And I just had a long debate with Gloria Laddings-Billings, who's here, a retired professor here, and one of the people who actually created critical race theory as a theory. And she stresses over and over again, it's a theory. And we disagree heartily on if it should be taught in the schools at all. She does not believe it should be taught in the schools, in the K-12 system at all, or discussed. And she's the founder of it. And I disagree. I think it should not be taught at the elementary or middle school level because it's just too controversial and too confusing. But I think at the high school level, a meaningful discussion of critical race theory could take place. We had this discussion for about 15 minutes on a radio show, and she didn't back down, and I didn't either.
Couple of things to unpack here. Probably the most obvious is how critical race theory is related to the January 6th riots at the Capitol. We'll get to that in a moment. But Dr. Witte mentions Professor Gloria Ladson-Billings. She's an academic who first applied critical race theory to her education policy research. She's very much been there since the beginning, and when asked during the very interview Dr. Witte had mentioned, she provided her definition of critical race theory being, quote, "It is an attempt to begin to understand racial disparity. If you look over the history of the nation, we started out in 1600 up into the mid-20th century, literally saying that the reason there were racial disparities is because there were biological and intellectual deficiencies. We finally put that myth to rest, and eugenics has fallen out of favor. I would say in the next few years, we begin to look at issues of equal opportunity. So we had the Brown decision. Certainly we had Reconstruction. We had the Brown decision, the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act. So we've had the opportunities, but they all get rolled back. We can show you clearly in the history of the nation that we roll those back. So critical race theory is yet another way to think about how do we understand racial disparity?" End quote. The interviewer asked her clearly, does critical race theory teach to hate white people? Her response was, quote, "Absolutely not. In several of the interviews that I have done before, I've done interviews with print reporters, I've sent them articles, I've written in them when they contacted me. I said, what in those articles says that you should hate white people? They all agree it's not there. It's not there." End quote. All right, so critical race theory is talking about racial disparity that existed before and how it exists today. But is there actual racial disparity today? There are those that will point to our nation's first black president, to the Civil Rights Act, to the prominence of black actors, musicians, writers, and athletes, that perhaps those people are indicators that racial disparity doesn't exist anymore.
In other words, it's in the education institutions, it's our employment. It starts very young with children. It's in our criminal system. And if you take a look at the raw numbers on these situations, it's pretty hard to say there isn't, because African American, particularly males, but females as well, do not do as well in all of those situations. They don't do as well in income. They don't do as well in education. They have a higher incarceration rates. In my state, very high. For example, the gaps in Wisconsin between whites and blacks in education and incarceration are just enormous, highest in the country. So it's hard to deny the statistical side of that. The question, of course, is the causation side. And if the causation side is just blatant discrimination, I think a lot of people resist that because they don't see themselves as racist. They don't see how that could happen. Now, having said that, and I put myself in that category, having said that, I had a friend of mine once who's African-American who told me something, and he's a very sophisticated guy, more than I am probably, and educated and well off. He told me that the one thing you don't understand is when I go into a grocery store, a clerk follows me around. Or if I go into a pharmacy, it's very likely that some young kid who's working behind the counter with the people behind the counter is going to follow me around because they think I'm going to steal something. And I must admit, I have never in my life felt anything like that in any kind of a situation like that. And that's a terrible, terrible thought. And this is not an exaggerated person. This has got to be something that happens to people all the time of race. And if you think about that, those sort of anecdotes, it does make you wonder a lot.
This is where I think a lot of people feel the heartburn when it comes to critical race theory. Some folks don't want to accept that experiences like being followed around in a store, being pulled over for no reason other than the color of your skin, or racism in general still exist. But again, as someone whose skin is brown, I can tell you that it does exist. And for those who deny it, I don't know how to prove to you that it's a thing without having a full-blown argument. It's back to the all or nothing argument. For some folks, there is a sentiment that discussion of racial disparity is either blaming all white people for racism or accepting that racism doesn't exist. That the answer can't possibly be that racism exists because some people are racist. Which brings us back to critical race theory again. Not blaming anyone for racism, but simply bringing about the discussion of racial disparity in the United States often through the lens of African Americans. As for critical race theory being taught, well, it's not being taught at the K-12 level. In fact, Professor Gloria Ladson-Billings expressly does not think it should be taught even to undergraduates. She believes that it's just a theory in the academic sense, and that she only introduced it to, quote, to graduate students looking for a theoretical frame to bolster an argument, end quote.
Well, first of all, it's very hard to deal with it, to deal with race. And the reason for that is everybody has their own race. And so they're sitting there in front of this classroom and they're going to say, no, wait a minute, I can't, which side do I take? I got to be careful. For my case, I'm a white male. I got to be careful. I probably would play down the privileges, I would probably play up the privileges of white maleness just simply so I don't think I'm taking sides. But that shows you how difficult it is to deal with these things. And also, it's fragile in the sense that you can really harm people. I told somebody in an interview earlier today that one of the things, if you do this teaching it, what you got to do is you got to keep your eyes on the eyes of the students and the faces of the students. And when you see grimaces and things, and you're going to see them, that's when you know you might have stepped over a line and said something that offended somebody. And you don't know if it's going to be white or black, but you got to be very cognizant of that. So it's a difficult thing to do. I would do it actually, and the way I did these sorts of things was I did it by setting up discussion situations, such as what if I'd set up, it's sort of the Harvard case method, but done personally, set up a situation where you're in a racial context situation and there's a racial setup, and then start a discussion about what would you do in that context, rather than simply saying and certainly I don't think the generals and top people should do it because they will be bound by policy and every word they say will be probably recorded or reported or something. So I would not let top level people do this class. I mean, supporting it in policy areas and in public like the general did, that's fine. That's their role. Not teaching in an individual class, say at West Point, even. And that's the highest level you got. So that's the way I think you'd set it up through scenarios and then draw it out from there. I don't think lecturing on it in any ways is going to get you anything but either look fake or look canned or look like you're not telling the truth to them.
During another exchange in Washington, Senator Cotton of Arkansas presented Secretary of Defense Austin several examples of classes taught by service members to service members about race that missed the mark and were reported to Congressman Crenshaw's whistleblower website, the same one he tweeted about mentioning woke ideology. Senator Cotton's examples include reading books mentioning white supremacy, classes on police brutality, and an instance where an Air Force unit was taken on a privilege walk, quote, where members of the wing were ordered to separate themselves by race and gender in order to stratify people based on their perceived privilege, end quote. Now here's the thing, the professor who helped develop critical race theory doesn't think it should be taught at all, unless you're perhaps at a graduate level in a university. And Dr. Witte feels like this topic needs to be taught very carefully by someone who knows how to teach this topic, preferably a professional educator. What seems to have happened is that military units were told, Hey, talk about this topic and do a class on it. And that's what they did. The Privilege Walk is a college workshop activity, quote, designed to provide college students with an opportunity to understand the intricacies of privilege and to explore the ways that we enjoy privileges based on being members of social identity groups in the United States, end quote. This is a college workshop activity that itself has been heavily criticized, and many organizations and institutions don't even do it anymore. It's likely that some airman or Air Force officer remembered doing this in college or high school and thought, hey, this would be a great idea, not realizing that it could be very inappropriate. I've tried to find officially sanctioned classes from the DoD or the branches on teaching race, and the most I could find was a 2-page paper that reads more like a pamphlet titled Difficult Conversations, Racial and Ethnic Diversity. Even the DoD's Office for Diversity, Equality, and Inclusion website's Resources tab just leads you to a list of all the other branch components' homes' websites. The armydiversity.army.mil website, Education and Training tab, which is exactly where you'd go to click maybe to find classes or something, has 2 words: coming soon. No classes, no tools, nothing. So is it any wonder that a graduate level diversity class fell flat and at worst was offensive and even racist because it was taught by service members to service members at the lowest echelon by Googling words, slapping together a PowerPoint and hoping you did a good enough job so you could go back to doing your actual job? Representative Matt Gaetz and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin.
How should the Department of Defense think about critical race theory?
I don't know what the issue of critical race theory is and what the relevance here with the department. We do not teach critical race theory. We don't embrace critical race theory, and I think that's a spurious conversation. And so we are focused on extremist behaviors and not ideology, not people's thoughts, not people's political orientation. Behaviors is what we're focused on.
General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was provided an opportunity during the same session to provide his thoughts on critical race theory, which unsurprisingly starts off with an admission that the DoD isn't exactly sure what critical race theory is.
On the issue of critical race theory, et cetera, I'll obviously have to get much smarter on whatever the theory is. But I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university, and it is important that we train and we understand. And I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it. So what is it that caused thousands of people to assault this building and try to overturn the Constitution of the United States of America? What caused that? I want to find that out. I want to maintain an open mind here, and I do want to analyze it. It's important that we understand that because our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians, they come from the American people. So it is important that the leaders, now and in the future, do understand it. I've read Mao Zedong. I've read Karl Marx. I've read Lenin. That doesn't make me a communist. So what is wrong with understanding, having some situational understanding about the country for which we are here to defend? And I personally find it offensive that we are accusing the United States military, our general officers, our commissioned, non-commissioned officers of being, quote, woke or something else because we're studying some theories that are out there. That was started at Harvard Law School years ago, and it proposed that there were laws in the United States, antebellum laws prior to the Civil War, that led to a power differential with African Americans that were 3/4 of a human being when this country was formed. And then we had a Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation to change it. And we brought it up to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. It took another 100 years to change that. So look it, I do want to know. And I respect your service, and you and I are both Green Berets. But I want to know. And it matters to our military and the discipline and cohesion of this military. And I thank you for the opportunity to make a comment.
I agree with General Milley that being well-read and exposed to different frames of thought is important to developing smart and effective leaders. Understanding how the enemy thinks increases our warfighters' lethality on the battlefield for sure. But where he lost me was the January 6th assault on the Capitol being connected to white rage. I was following along on social media. I had friends at the protest before it turned ugly that weren't at all white. The Marine rapper, a controversial African-American rapper whom I know personally, performed for the crowd there. As the events of the 6th unfolded, I never felt like it was a racial thing. I felt like it was a political thing.
During that, I watched that whole day like you did, like many other people were fascinated by it. I didn't think about race the entire day. It didn't occur to me. It wasn't, even the announcers were not talking about it. And only later did they talk about QAnon. QAnon was not, we didn't know what it was really then. This is January 6th. We know more about what it's supposed to be now. And I don't even know if it really exists in the way it's so crazy. But they didn't even talk about that much. What they were talking about, they were focusing on the insurrection and the argument that the race was stolen, that these people felt it was stolen. I didn't see racism involved at all. And even with Trump, he didn't mention race. He said go down there and create trouble, right? But he didn't say go down there and beat up black people. And he's getting linked to that, but he never said anything. I don't think he uttered a racial comment that entire day.
I saw one thing during that January 6th attack that gave me pause for a moment to consider racism. And that was the man holding the Confederate flag in the Capitol building. I'm sure there were some others, but racists will show up to just about anything if they think they can get away with it. And by the way, just because you wave the Confederate flag or a rebel flag doesn't mean I think you're a racist. Insensitive, sure, but I'll give any rebel flag waver the chance to be a decent person. I'm not about to play the all or nothing game with the rebel flag. I hope that this episode provided you with some clarity on an issue that's already been muddied by every politician, activist, and leader with an agenda. And honestly, that's what all this comes down to. Trying to confuse you. Making a term meant to mean awareness for social issues a bad word full of baggage. Making critical race theory mean something that it's not. The real divisiveness lies in all or nothing ideology, that we can't believe two things at once, that the middle ground is weakness, or that the left or the right wants to destroy America. The most liberal person and the most conservative person wants this country to survive and be shaped by their ideals. But I think the truth is that most folks in this country are not hardcore left or hardcore right. They don't blame any one race of today for the sins of history. Most people don't want to be victimized, and most people want to accept others with different lifestyles, even if they don't align with their own. My experience is that service members aren't perfect, like our country. BK's right about the country being a melting pot, and so is our military. But in the midst of all that melting, boiling, and tension, there's a service member who's overworked, underpaid, achy joints, and dislike for PT that's always too early and close of business that's always too late. The service member who complains about their unit the whole time that they're there, but misses their colleagues and friends the moment they PCS to their next duty station. We're not all good, and we're not all bad. We just are. And you shouldn't need a PowerPoint to know that's okay. This episode was written and produced by me, Rod Rodriguez, with additional assistance by Jack Murphy. Huge thanks to Brian Kimber, BK, and Dr. John Witte for their time and expertise. BK's social media links will be in the show notes. Be sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Twitter at StripesMMPod. That's StripesMMPod. Go to stripes.com and use promo code podcast to get 50% off your digital subscription. That's 50% off when you use promo code podcast. I'm Rod Rodriguez, and I will see you at the next episode.